China has said quite explicitly that it doesn't want to see Russia lose, because if Russia were to lose in a grand strategic sense, then America's gaze and vision would be on China. So you would potentially be worried if you were a Chinese geostrategist about the success of this operation and how the American combat power and capability across all the sort of joint domains, as Dan Kane said, was employed. But it was only a tactical action, an extremely successful tactical action. And that doesn't mean that the day after scenarios are going to be good for the future. And that is the real trick if you've achieved strategic success in ultimately in what happened in Venezuela over the weekend.
Lifting it up a bit, you mentioned Venezuela. In the last 24 hours, we've had the U.S. Secretary of State for War. I can't believe I'm saying that. Pete Hegseth turning around and in a press conference, he's been laughing at the ability of the combined Chinese and Russian air defense capability, and almost poking at Vladimir Putin and saying how useless his capabilities were. And we've got a build-up for potentially US forces, or there's rumors going around that they may be trying to capture a Shadow Fleet tanker that's off the west coast of Ireland in international waters at the moment. And Putin is getting concerned about the impact that everything is having on his ability to fund the war with his Shadow Fleet and Ukrainian success through 2025 and elsewhere. Do you think we're seeing the sort of green shoots of a political sea change with what Hegseth has said, potentially saying to Putin, back in your box, you're just not complying with us, and tie that in with Trump's comments after he had criticized the Ukrainians for attacking Trump's residence, and then had to come out and try and suggest he had been misled?
I don't think he's done it in a strong enough sense. Now, actually, the failure of the Russian air defense, and of course it's wider than that in Venezuela, is not the first occasion. So, for example, the Israeli F-35s were able to penetrate Syrian airspace with impunity, where there were Russian S-300s, S-400s from 2015. Now, part of the notion there is that they weren't switched on at all. And part of the reason for that, explanation for that, has been that they feared to be found out against Western technology. The second occasion of that, of course, was the escalation dominance of both Israel and America in the raids in June 25 into Iran. And this is the third occasion, because again, there should have been these significant air defense in Venezuela. And I think it is wider than that in geopolitical sense, of course, because if you were to say that both China, Iran, and Russia are adversaries, and actually the national security strategy didn't really say that about Russia, so there's a bit of a caveat on that, then one of the unspoken things about Venezuela is to clear those elements out of the Western Hemisphere from a American perspective. Even wider than that, I think the oil could be a bit of a red herring. So, for example, I have a very senior friend in the oil industry who was brought in Trump's first administration to look at rescoping the infrastructure in 2019 when Guaido was the opposition leader who the Americans thought was going to be in power. It's not an easy speak to do the Venezuelan oil. People quote the wrong statistics. Having 300 billion barrels or whatever it is of reserves in the ground is not a useful metric. How much does it take to get a barrel of oil out of the ground in Venezuela? Well, it takes between $55 and $70 per barrel, because it is a very heavy crude, which you need the infrastructure to pipe a lighter dilutant south to mix with the very heavy crude to get it north. It is not an easy process, and if the infrastructure has been ruined during that period, no American oil company is going to rush in when there's already a glut in the global market. So let's put the oil aside for one of the aspects of this. And of course, if you have a glut of oil with more Venezuelan oil, the price will drop, and therefore your marginal value for money investment decisions are even broken. The second one is, what was the Chinese monopoly, particularly in Venezuela, on um, uh, uh, rare earth minerals? That could be one of the reasons. So, since the April 25, when the Chinese put a restriction on rare earth minerals from China, one of the strategic deficiencies of the Americans has been rare earth minerals. Venezuela could technically give them an in on that. And the third reason was there was manufacturing in Venezuela from Iranian Shahed drones. So all those from a Pentagon military strategic perspective give you a reason to go in. Now, I'm not saying that was the predominant reason because of the way that Trump works, but in terms of public messaging, it's easier to message about oil than some of those other things that I've mentioned.
Interesting, you mentioned rare earth metals and China. Do you think China is trying to gain control as part of its the way it'll be forcing Russia to mortgage itself to get and continue to keep Chinese support? China's wrestling control of the rare earth mineral mines and other natural resource mines and deposits that there are throughout parts of Russia.
Well, China has said quite explicitly that it doesn't want to see Russia lose, because if Russia were to lose in a grand strategic sense, then America's gaze and vision would be on China. So you would potentially be worried if you were a Chinese geostrategist about the success of this operation and how the American combat power and capability across all the sort of joint domains, as Dan Kane said, was employed. But it was only a tactical action, an extremely successful tactical action. And that doesn't mean that the day after scenarios are going to be good for the future. And that is the real trick if you've achieved strategic success in ultimately in what happened in Venezuela over the weekend.
But if we look at things from from Putin's perspective as to what's happening geopolitically around the world, he's lost his primary supporter in Venezuela, and it looks as if the pressure that'll come from Donald Trump, there will not be someone who will support Putin and support Xi Jinping staying in power, or they'll not do that overtly. Iran seems to be falling apart at the moment. Putin's lost his support in Syria. Is he becoming more and more isolated? And do you think Vladimir Putin will be getting concerned that his sphere of influence and the wider sphere of influence amongst the BRICS community is beginning to fall apart, and he's finding himself more and more on his own? And do you think that will force him to try and strengthen his ties more with China and North Korea?
I don't think that would be proven yet because of the international reaction to what the Americans did. Although the international sphere has been under strain in the last few years, and the international rules-based order has been under strain, I think people will not necessarily, or will hedge their bets unless you absolutely need America as the indispensable nation. Now, of course, the indispensable nation is a phrase first used by Madeleine Albright in, I think, 1998, but was actually used again by Bob Gates around the time of the WikiLeaks, because, of course, what that showed, for example, was that America was sort of spying on the German president, for example, so Angela Merkel. But the point he made is people deal with America not because they like them or they trust them, but because they need them. And that is going to be how the international relations will work here. What Trump has upended in a way is the sort of notion that might is right, and that power, military power and political power is the whole thing which influences this thing. I don't think that he has a Reagan Republican view of an ideal world where laissez-faire economics and free trade is the way to go. I think that he has redefined that, Trump, for America and the world in terms of what I would call commodity mercantilism. I think he sees Ukraine largely as a commodity. He doesn't really care about sovereignty and independence. I think he also sees Venezuela as a commodity. He doesn't really care about their sovereignty. That's not actually in doubt at the moment, their territorial integrity. But of course, they could lose their independence if he thinks he's the man in charge. That also creates a danger for him because people don't like that notion of someone externally being in charge. And that's actually, I would argue, one of the reasons why, for example, when the Soviet Union unraveled, that the countries which were formerly part of the Soviet Union wanted to so readily and quickly join NATO because they wanted real security from Russia. They weren't coerced into joining NATO.
Well, yes, and Trump does not, or the United States does not have a good history in follow-up operations after a degree of tactical success and dealing with things in the long term. But what do you think this means for what's going to happen throughout 2026 in Ukraine and the pressures that there are on Russia, especially economic pressures, and the war is coming home to the Russians? There are regular attacks against Russian airfields. The last 3 or 4 days over the New Year period, there have been no flights in and out of many of Moscow's airports because of Ukrainian drone attacks. How do you think things are going to play out, certainly in the first half of this year?
Well, I don't see. Let's look at this again in terms of a triangle. So the three sides of a triangle from both sides are pressure, reward, and concessions. I just don't see any evidence of Putin making any concessions whatsoever. He is stuck to his hard line that it's all NATO's fault, it's all Ukraine's fault. Unless we give in to his demands, then either the war will continue. So there are no concessions from the Russian side. Now, Ukraine, I think, has been very pragmatic and adopting a sort of realist policy in the last couple of months in the negotiations, particularly in two areas. The first one is in terms of how they've framed the Donbass in terms of disengagement, but it should be on both sides to free trade zone, be it 5, 15 or 40 kilometers. And the second one is in terms of undercutting all that Putin says about the illegitimacy of Putin by sort of saying we can hold elections at a reasonable time. I think there's an interesting counterpoint to that Trump saying that he can't hold elections in 30 days, of course, in Venezuela. So Trump's line is being undercut, but it's really this thing about Trump and where do his beliefs lie? If he thinks that he's a good mate of Putin and that he admires Putin because Putin can get things done as a sort of autocratic leader, then he's just not going to put the pressure on him, the second part of the triangle, that he's put on Zelensky. And therefore, you could argue that the events of 2025 were rewards for Putin in terms of going to Alaska, coming out of international isolation and dealing with the Don in there. And it doesn't seem that Zelensky had any rewards, and we had that terrible spectacle, of course, in the White House in February 2025. So it's whether that triangle, the shape of it changes and the pressure goes on Putin, and how the executive and the executive versus Trump comes out. What is going to be the position of the Senate, particularly as we get to the second part of the year, when the composition of both the House and the Senate might change. What's also interesting, I think, from the American polling is that, again, the support for Ukraine is pretty high still. It's between 62, 64% for wishing Ukraine to win. So do we really see that Trump will come down on their side? Now, if you go back to September 2024 and the Helsinki Commission, the one which looks at US-Russian relations, it was said then by the chairman that at some stage Trump will see that Putin is not interested in a peace and is not an honest interlocutor. We still haven't got to that position with Trump. Will we ever get to that position? That's a $60,000 question. Thank you, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.